Hi, in this video we're going to do a demo walkthrough of how to create a connection to a table source, such as a database. Then we'll create a source manually using that table connection. And then we'll walk through how to bulk create table sources using your connection through the connection metadata. And then the last thing that we'll walk through in this example is how to update your table sources to use incremental queries as opposed to pulling the full table every time. So if we get started in our DataForge workspace, we'll go to the Connections tab, and then we're going to create a new connection here. And I'm just going to call it AW SQL Server. So it's just an example AdventureWorks database that lives in SQL Server. Our connection direction is going to be source. So we're going to ingest data from the tables. Our connection type is going to be table. Uses agent we're going to leave as no in this example because our Databricks clusters will have network connectivity to the database. However, if you did have an on-prem database, etc., something that you could not connect to through this network, you can always select yes. You can install an agent somewhere on a machine that does have connectivity to it, and you can use that agent to actually pull the data through this connection. So again, what we're going to use no in this example. Our driver is just effectively we have different types of database drivers that we can use here, such as generic JDBC, MySQL. We're going to use SQL Server in this case, and then we'll expand our parameters. And then you can see there's a number of different parameters here that are available. First off, we're going to populate the database name. So I'm going to use that AdventureWorks, and we have our host. So the host name, it's currently located in AWS. And then I'm going to give it credentials here for user and password. And then you can see that there's also actually a connection string option. So if you did not want to separate out all these different fields, you could just paste in a full connection string, and that would work as well. Additionally, there's optional parameters for encryption and trusting the server certificate. Just obviously you can play around with this to kind of fit the need that you have for your database. And then the last thing just to cover here is the top two parameters are actually not necessarily for connecting to the database, but actually pulling back connection metadata about what's available in that database. So if we leave it on the default, we're going to grab all the different tables that are available within the connection, all the different keys for those tables, and we can basically build a map of what you can bulk create and what you can see to use. So if we save this connection, what's going to happen here is we see the connection metadata tab pop up. You can see that there's no metadata in here currently because we just saved it. And what happens is every time we save a new connection or we modify a connection, DataForge will launch a connection test, which you can see running here. And once that connection test is done, our connection metadata will be populated with that list of tables like I talked about, and that's how we'll bulk create our sources rather than doing it manually by hand. And so we'll give that a few minutes to complete, and while we wait for that to happen, we'll go to sources, and we're going to create a new table source. And so we're going to call this AW, and we're going to pull from the customer table. We'll give it a description that's going to be demo. And then you can see the rest of our source settings here that are available. So most of these we do have defaults available in DataForge. So for example, the process config, you're effectively selecting what types of clusters do I want to use for each different type of process that's going to run in this source. Most times the default will work just fine. However, if you did know that you had a larger set of data or a much smaller set of data, you can certainly customize and select from different options or create your own process config to really fine tune your jobs. The next one is going to be cleanup config, which again, there is a default here. However, you could specify different retention settings and attach it to the source. Processing type for tables, we do support batch or stream for Delta tables. In this case, we're going to stick with batch processing. We've got our connection type of table. And then for the connection, we can use this drop down and select the connection we just created. And then we'll add our source query. So again, just a standard select statement. So we've got our source query in there. Now, we also have the data refresh selection. In this example, I'm just going to use full, although you'll learn more about the other refresh types through the training. And then we're going to leave the default schedule. In addition, there's going to be a bunch of different parameters that you can use based on whether it's for the ingestion process, for parsing the schema, and schema evolution, if you want to set up alerts to send you emails, whether there were successes or failures, as well as different options for performance and cost in terms of setting up a number of retries if there was a failure for any reason, etc. So in this example, we're going to leave all those defaults and we're going to save this. And then if we go to our inputs tab, we can just run a new poll now just to get some example data in here. And we've already got a cluster up and running, so we'll see that kind of go through from ingestion all the way through to refresh. So while that runs, now that we've actually set up a table source by hand, what I want to do is go back to my connections. And if I look at now my connection metadata for that new connection we created, I can see all the different tables that are available for me to pull, as well as the primary key, foreign key, and then DataForge also builds this reference tables map here for you. So again, if I search for sales, I can see my sales schema. And then within here, if we use that same table, the customer, I can select the checkbox here and then use the menu options to either add the reference tables from customer, or I can add reference tables recursively. And so it basically just gives me every source, or it sets up a source for every table that is related to customer. And so now if I use that same menu option, I can hit create sources. And we'll just use a unique naming pattern here. So we'll just call it AW2, and then it'll be the schema.table name. We'll turn on the create relations and initiate data pulls so that we get an example data for all those sources that are created. And now we can see that there were 4 sources created in bulk. And so we can open those up. So if I go back to my sources, I can see that those 4 sources are now set up. They're currently running new ingestions. And if I open the sources, we can see basically all those same settings that we set up by hand. However, there's a couple changes just based on how the sources were both created, and that they use a key refresh and use those primary keys for the key columns. And so we can also see all the relations that were both created between the sources, so we don't have to do any of that work by hand. So this is a huge time saver. And that's how you very quickly bulk create, hundreds of sources at a time if necessary. Now the last thing that I want to show you is how you can, again, make your source queries incremental. So if you remember when we created that first source, we created it with just a select statement from the full table. So rather than pulling the full table every time, what we can do is actually use tokens within our source query. Depending on the refresh type, there's different tokens available within DataForge. So we're just going to go through those options really quickly. So the first one is if we used custom refresh, for example, what we have is basically a watermark that you can use as a token here. So it's just latest watermark. And how that works is in the CDC parameters, you can identify a column within the schema that's going to be your watermark column. And then you set up an initial value for the first data pull of what it actually should pull. And then what we do is every time there's a new ingestion, DataForge will replace this latest watermark token with the max value of that watermark column that currently lives in the hub table. So just as an example, if we go to our inputs tab, I can see I have an initial pull here with 120 some thousand records. And if I look at the ingestion query in the logs, we can see that it uses this default value that we created for the watermark. And then on the very next pull, because there was already data then in the hub table, what will happen is we then take the max of that watermark column from the hub table, and we use that as our token value here. So the next example is going to be for extract date time. So we talked about latest watermark. Another token you can use is extract date time, just like this. And there's no settings in the parameters that you need to set up here. This is available for any of the sources for the table. And how this works is it's effectively the latest pull of data that you did that gets replaced in here. So if we think about our inputs again, we have 2 inputs. The first one just did a full table pull, and that happened at 2:40 p.m. Central Time. Now, when we look at the ingestion query for the second ingestion, it pulled no records because the token was replaced with that same timestamp of the first input. So it effectively is saying, pull me all the records that were added to the table or modified based on this column here since that last input was run. And we haven't adjusted our table at all. So we end up with a 0 record input here. But as it continues to pull and there's new records in the table or modified records, we'll continue to get the incremental record counts here instead of our 0. So the next one to look at, again, for key refresh, this time we can use, instead of extract date time, we'll use latest timestamp. And how this works is in the CDC parameters, you identify a date column. So in this case, we used modified date. And again, that's just within our table schema here. So we look here. And how this works, what happens here is the date column is again substituted with for the latest timestamp. So every time an ingestion runs, this token effectively looks at the max of this column from the current hub table. And so again, if we look at our examples, we have that first full pull, and that uses a default value in the ingestion source query. And then the second input is going to use the max of that timestamp column for the comparison. So again, we end up with a 0 record input here because nothing's been modified in the table since this date here. And so these are just common tokens that you can use throughout your kind of a production environment. Another one here for none refresh is, again, the exact same setup as the custom refresh, where you can use the latest watermark. So again, in your CDC parameters, you'd set up that column identifier. You'd set up an initial value. For the first pull, it's going to use the initial value. For every pull after that, it's going to take the max of that watermark column. The next example here for sequence refresh is latest sequence. So if we look at our range column here, there's not going to be any additional settings you need to set up, but the range column is then substituted, or excuse me, the value from that range column is substituted in for latest sequence. And again, it's the max of that range column of what exists in the hub table when the ingestion runs. And so again, if we look here, we have that basically default value that was used for the first. And the default for a sequence is going to be this -1. And then the ingestion after that is going to use the max sequence from that sequence column for the incremental queries from then on. And so as you have new inputs, you theoretically have larger sequence numbers. Those will continue to get replaced in your ingestion queries each time. And then the last example is the same as what we looked at for key refresh, but this time for timestamp refresh. And again, there's going to be no settings here that you need to play around with. But what we'll do is use the same date column and we'll take basically the max of this date column and substitute it in for this token. So again, when we look at our inputs, we have the default, the first input that pulled everything. And then the second input has 0 records because it takes the max of that date column for the comparison. And so that's how you'd set up a table connection. And then if you needed to manually set up a source using that table connection, or if you needed to use the connection metadata to bulk create your sources and relations. And then lastly, how you can update your source settings to take into account incremental refreshes as opposed to the full table pulls. So hopefully this helps. Thanks.